We have come to the moment, the whole importance of today. So I encourage you to look around at your tables and those next to you and remind yourselves we're here together. We do this together. I am thinking of my very good friend's sister who was lost in a hospital 2 years ago. And so this is very meaningful, and I thank you in advance. We are coming to the apology. I do ask NEB to now come to the stage to take their place. And for the rest of us, we are now here to listen to the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions share their apology and their commitment to reconciliation on behalf of 250,000 nurses all across this country. And so we ask you to listen to them and with your hearts, with your minds, with your souls, with your bodies, and to think of all those who are also online to take care of yourselves. Linda, Angela, can I turn this over to you?
We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and stewards of these lands on which we live, benefit, and prosper. From east to west to north, we pay our respects to First Nations, Inuit, Métis, knowledge holders, elders past, present, and emerging. We understand that these lands are and always will be Indigenous, even though it is colonially known as Canada. We recognize the Indigenous peoples today, and future generations will need to be cared for in ways that nurture relational obligations. We recognize that we also have responsibilities to nurture relationships with Indigenous peoples, but the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions needs to do better. Indigenous peoples deserve to be heard and respected. They deserve the very best care possible in hospitals, clinics, and long-term care. Indigenous peoples deserve to feel safe in our care and to trust that nurses are effective advocates for them. Instead, Canada and the healthcare system did harm to our Indigenous peoples, and we need to apologize to our Indigenous peoples for our part. As nurses, we must face our past with honesty and humility. This is the truth that must come before meaningful reconciliation.
Nursing training programs in Canada are rooted in Western biomedical science, a system that has historically ignored, dismissed, and disrespected Indigenous knowledge. While Western health care emphasizes the individual, Indigenous understanding of wellness and social determinants of health are holistic, grounded in community, land, ceremony, and interconnection. Western-based healthcare has actively suppressed Indigenous knowledge. Instead of collaborating with Indigenous peoples on what is considered good health, Western-based healthcare has historically dismissed Indigenous knowledge and folklore as irrelevant or non-scientific, and so played a significant role in Canada to nullify or dismiss Indigenous knowledges. This is dismal, it is not neutral, it is colonial.
Colonial governments enforce these colonial approaches through laws and policies that criminalized Indigenous ceremonies, languages, and cultural practices. These actions were a violation of human rights. We know that ceremony is a part of Indigenous well-being, a beautiful way of maintaining balance with the land and the others. It is essential. Today, we acknowledge the deep harm caused by dismissing Indigenous knowledges of well-being, which was fundamentally wrong. Today, we see that the dismissal of Indigenous knowledges contributes to racism against Indigenous peoples. We apologize to Indigenous peoples for not listening to you, for devaluing the wisdom that has sustained your communities for generations, and for dismissing the knowledge which has kept you well for countless generations. True health care must be co-created, rooted in respect, reciprocity, and the recognition that Indigenous knowledge is not only valid, but vital.
The healthcare system and the science that underpins it has not historically served Indigenous peoples with equity, respect, or justice. In many cases, it actively refused to serve them at all. The Indian residential schools were designed under the colonial mandate, in the words of then Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, to kill the Indian in the child. These institutions became sites of systemic neglect, abuse, death. Healthcare was not provided to children in residential schools, or was not provided on par with any other Canadian child. Thousands of children died of preventable diseases, including tuberculosis, because they were denied even the most basic health care, which continues to this day.
Federal policies directed healthcare professionals to give services that were less than what was given to any other Canadian. Health professionals, including nurses, did not challenge the federal government policies and so did not protect Indigenous children. In residential schools, nurses were present when unethical medical and nutritional experiments occurred. We acknowledge that nurses were complicit in the neglect and the abuse of Indigenous children. Rather than advocating for the well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, nurses became complicit in their suffering.
The decisions to underserve or not serve Indigenous peoples was not only unethical, but they were also deeply racist. Healthcare at times agreed with the racism that said Indigenous peoples were genetically inferior and therefore more susceptible to disease. This fueled systemic racism and contributed to the devastating health inequities Indigenous communities continue to face today. The government and healthcare policies that created inequity for Indigenous healthcare and the racism are both wrong. Nurses provided inadequate care and failed to advocate against the deplorable conditions that led to widespread illness and death, and as such, failed to uphold ethical standards. We failed to protect children. We failed to speak out against the inhumanity occurring in the institutions at which we served. We deeply apologize to First Nations, Inuit and Métis people for our inaction. We deeply apologize to First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples for our actions that caused you harm and for the harm caused by our silence. We apologize for the care that was denied, for the trust that was broken, and for the lives that were lost.
Recently, survivors of Indian hospitals reached a class action settlement, an official acknowledgement of the profound harms committed against Indigenous peoples. The Government of Canada created Indian hospitals as a separate hospital system for Indigenous people, But everything about these institutions was deeply racist and designed to segregate and devalue Indigenous lives. From their inception, Indian hospitals were marked by systemic discrimination, offered substandard care, frequently operating without consent, and violated the most basic human rights.
Survivors have bravely shared their story about non-consensual treatment, abuse, and substandard levels of care that failed to meet the scientific standard, much less ethical standards. Nurses worked in these institutions. Nurses were present. Too often, they remained silent in the face of suffering. They did not advocate. We acknowledge that nurses were complicit.
We need to know the truth of our country's history to understand why reconciliation is so necessary. While people in this room today may not have worked directly with Indian hospitals, we must live with the truth of the actions of our profession. We must ensure that we are accountable for understanding how nursing has contributed to the harm. We carry the responsibility to ensure that such abuses are never repeated. We cannot claim to stand for health and healing if we refuse to acknowledge the pain that was caused. We are deeply ashamed that our profession did not uphold our own core principles of compassionate, ethical, and equitable care. Nurses did not provide safe or compassionate care. We did not protect First Nations, Métis, or Inuit patients. With humility, we must offer our deepest apologies to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for our role at these institutions, for the betrayal of trust, and for the harm caused.
While we must have enough knowledge to understand the historical reasons for reconciliation, we must also be truthful about the current levels of racism in healthcare against Indigenous peoples. Racism threatens Indigenous patient safety. The systemic racism that led to separate beds and separate hospitals for Indigenous peoples still lingers in the structures and policies of our institutions, and it continues to impact Indigenous peoples today. The healthcare system is still underfunded in Indigenous communities compared to the rest of the country. We have not stood up for the funding in Indigenous communities that they need and deserve. And we have not stood up for justice for Indigenous healthcare equity.
Racism in healthcare has long been justified by false and dehumanizing beliefs. That Indigenous people are genetically inferior, that they feel less pain, and they do not comply with treatment. These ideas are rooted in ignorance and hate, and they have shaped clinical decisions, denied necessary care, and caused lasting trauma. When Indigenous patients experience poor outcomes, the system often blames them rather than examining how racism and inequality have shaped their care. That is wrong. We must take responsibility for our part and do better.
One of the horrific examples of this ongoing violence for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women has been forced and coerced sterilization, with some as recent as 2023, and sometimes without them even knowing. These acts were violations of human rights, of bodily autonomy, and of medical ethics. Nurses were in the room. We did not stop it. We were complicit in the misuse of power over a patient when we should have been protectors of patient choice, safety, and dignity. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients and families should not feel unsafe in healthcare. The current racism and inequitable treatment that Indigenous peoples face is unacceptable and threatens patient safety. This is a truth that must come before reconciliation. We are ashamed that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples face racism in healthcare today. In our workplaces, we are supposed to be your advocates, and we have let you down. We apologize that racism continues to impact on your well-being, and we humbly ask you to give us another chance to show you the respect and the honor that is your right.
There have always been caregivers within Indigenous communities. When Indigenous people entered the nursing profession, they encountered the same racism that their families and communities experienced as patients. Virtually every single Indigenous nurse here in this room, watching online, and working to care for our families has experienced racism and witnessed racism against Indigenous patients. For decades, Indigenous peoples were not even allowed to become a nurse unless they gave up their Indigenous identity. That discriminatory policy did not end until the early 1970s. As we reflect on the history of nursing, it is crucial to acknowledge, honor, and elevate the contributions of Indigenous nurses. In humility, we owe them a debt of gratitude for their persistence and leadership. We must ensure the stories of Indigenous nurses are fully integrated into the narrative of the nursing profession. One way we can honor Indigenous nurses is to confront the racism, both systemic and interpersonal, that they continue to face in their chosen profession.
We cannot imagine the strength that Indigenous nurses show by choosing to be here with us today, and we thank you. We have not protected you against racism. We have not held up your contributions within our healthcare system, and for this we deeply apologize to you. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nurses. And we humbly request that you give us a chance to do better. The truth is often painful, especially when it's been hidden. Today, in this room and online, we hold each other up to be strong, and to face this truth. This is the truth before reconciliation.
An apology is only one step. It must be followed by action. CFNU knows that we are accountable for our actions, and we are committed to doing the best we can towards reconciliation. We recognize that we hold the power in our healthcare system, and we are committed to standing up for Indigenous people, safety, and inclusion. We are currently developing an action plan that will guide our paths forward. This plan is grounded in truth, responsibility, and accountability. We humbly ask Indigenous partners to hold us accountable to ensure that our actions match our words. I also speak personally. I'm committed to my own learning journey, building cultural competence, embracing cultural humility, and committing to the cultural safety. I'm doing the internal work so that I can one day earn the trust to say, you are safe with me. I invite you all to do the same. We are on a learning journey as nurses, as peers, and as friends. We will continue to learn and build our skill and capacity to provide culturally safe care. Today is another step on our journey, and we will not stop here. Please join us, reflect on what we can do in our role to advance reconciliation, support one another, learn from one another, lead together, apologize together. Thank you for joining us today and for joining the work of reconciliation. Merci, miigwech. Thank you, everyone. And I would like everyone to stand. And stand for a moment of silence for all of us to acknowledge those Indigenous people lost under our care at residential school, Indian hospitals, medical facilities of today, and those murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. You can sit down. Now I have to think of the elder this morning and remind me to breathe. Thank you so much, Susan and Marla. Thank you, Rose. It's been an interesting and powerful few months, and we're far from done. We have all learned together, and the advisory committee has been so cherished to all of us, and our work is not done. Now, I'll invite a femtor of mine, a strong Indigenous woman that I've admired and called on way too often. That's why there was a line in my apologies that I must do the learning exercise on my own. Tanya Dick is an RN, one of my femtors, and she's from the Denza Dane Oaks First Nation Band of Kingdom Inlet, and she is a junior elder and will say final words for this ceremony. Tanya, please.
Where's the stool? I'm okay. I'm okay. Thank you. I don't know whose idea it was to have me speak after that moment. It was a powerful moment for me as an Indigenous woman and as an Indigenous nurse to see our national leadership and the words they shared and their commitment to the work. I'm a registered nurse. I've been nursing for 23 years now, and I was reflecting on, when I was a baby nurse, my first CFNU convention was in Newfoundland, and I didn't really know up from down, but we managed to bring a resolution to the floor. But I was just reflecting on how at the time I wasn't allowed to use the word racism, white supremacy. The language was really, really constricted for me to bring conversations forward. And I didn't know at the time how deep that was. And I look at this convention today that CFNU is holding in Niagara Falls, and that's the dial moving. And it's hard being in the depth of the change and the advocacy for change for my people to notice that and to celebrate the successes. So just in that moment, understanding and listening to Candy DeSosa describe the Aboriginal Leadership Circle, and that was one of the first kind of advocacy moments that I experienced as a registered nurse under the BC Nurses Union, and how difficult that was to create and how difficult it was to keep that alive. And I think it is still difficult today. And it was so beautiful to see Deborah McPherson. She was the president at the time and a real champion for us as Indigenous nurses to be able to take the space and have voice that we deserve as Indigenous nurses, and continued to fight for us on a regular basis to ensure that that was well resourced, that it was budgeted, that it was given space, it was given time, it was given attention. And she had her allies at the executive level to continue to do that. And when we talk about, and we hear Alika talk about that resistance and that pushback, because this isn't how we do things normally, I just have so much appreciation and gratitude for the fight that has to happen outside of what I do. And it takes so many people around me for this dial to move. And just reflection, a lot of reflection yesterday and today about where we were in my beginning days, where we are today. And I always tell people whenever I have the opportunity, particularly with nursing students, that I truly feel like I'm a product of the BC Nurses Union. When I became a nurse and I was looking for myself in the profession, and I couldn't see it anywhere. I couldn't see myself anywhere on the wards in the hospital, on the bulletin boards. And then I saw this poster, and it was the call out for multicultural gathering at the BC Nurses Union, and that's what started the Equity Seeking Caucuses. We knew we needed space as Indigenous nurses. And I'm also a product, both my parents are survivors of residential school. And my mother was a registered nurse. She was allegedly the first First Nations nurse to graduate from the UBC School of Nursing. And when she got her degree, they wanted to do a news article and all of this other stuff. And this was 70s, 80s. And she was like, you guys should be embarrassed. You've only graduated one First Nations nurse. You got to do better. And I look back on my mother's days and I can't imagine her stories because she hasn't shared that with me. And she came out of that experience of residential school with a fire in her. She wanted to make a difference for those that were going to be behind her. She chose nursing. She chose nursing, and she took that, and it was the Red Power days, so she got to march and be an activist, and she even got arrested once. She's really proud of. It's nothing to be really proud of, but she talks about it a lot. And I just draw a lot from her. Both of my parents have never shared one story with me or my sister or my brother about their experiences, and they're very adamant that it was to protect us. And my approach was like, I need to hear this. I need the truth to heal. We need to do it together. And when we silence the truth and we hide the truth and we try and push it down because it's not what we do normally, we're stuck in this hamster wheel of status quo. And one of the strong health Indigenous leaders in British Columbia says status quo is literally killing Indigenous people in this province and across this country. And it's on us. I loved when Alika told us we have to take our power as nurses. We are the change. We are the change. We're the ones who literally You give us a problem as nurses, we probably can figure anything out. And I'll close by saying I phoned my mom, and I lost my dad in last July, so I phoned my mom. I would have loved to have a quote from both of them to share today, but particularly from my mom as a nurse. She's in the hospital right now, and she's holding her own. And I was telling her what was happening, and I was sharing my conversations with Linda and the team, and what this was, and what would you like me to say on your behalf? And she goes, oh. And I thought, oh no, she's just gonna be irritated and it's a bad time. And she was silent and she said, I wish we could just talk about it. I think if we talk about it and talk it out, we're gonna figure it out as nurses. And I just strongly encourage, and I know what you've witnessed today may be different. It's not the norm that we do at CFNU conventions, but bring this conversation forward. Ask questions. I went out at break and I sat at the fire and people were lining up and asking questions. Continue to ask questions. That's the change we want. And I'm gonna one last thing for Linda, my friend and mentor too. It's been an absolute privilege watching you lean into this process, and you've been so uncomfortable and being told to breathe. And I know there's a lot of parts that don't trust yourself in this. I just want to tell you that I trust you, and I believe in you, and I believe you're gonna lead all of these guys to do the work. And this is the discomfort we are all gonna feel on both sides of the fence. And that cultural safety and the humility piece, we're gonna make mistakes. It's always gonna happen. So just as nurses and critical thinkers and type A personalities, we're not very good at that, I know that. But it's part of reconciliation. We're beating a path forward to change for the futures before coming behind us. I'm just so moved today. My hope cup is so full, and I look at each and every one of you, and I look forward to the conversations. I look forward to the change, and I look forward to seeing you be all in when it comes to truth and reconciliation, when it comes to Indigenous specific racism in the healthcare system, and cultural safety and humility. I have always said the two greatest prides in my life is being a Musqueam woman and being a registered nurse. Gaila Kisla, thank you so much.